My son looked at me with a smile that felt rehearsed, polished by years of getting exactly what he wanted. And when I asked a simple question about the summer vacation I had paid for, the one I believed we would take together as a family, his eyes flicked briefly to his wife, before settling back on me with calm cruelty, and that was when he said it, casually, almost kindly, that they had already gone last week, that the trip was only for family. And in that moment, something inside me cracked quietly without a sound, because I realized I was no longer considered part of the family I had built, funded, and protected for decades. I was just the man who paid and stayed behind. I did not shout, I did not argue. I simply nodded while my daughter-in-law watched me like a judge watching a verdict she already knew was coming, and my son avoided my eyes as if shame were an inconvenience he could step around. They thought that was the end of it, that humiliation would keep me small, grateful for scraps of attention, willing to continue paying for their comfort while being excluded from their joy. But what they did not know was that betrayal has a way of waking something dangerous in a man who has already lost everything else. I had buried my wife, survived nights of silence, rebuilt my life brick by brick, and I had learned patience the hard way, the kind of patience that waits, observes, and remembers. Over the next weeks, I said nothing while they grew bolder, asking for money, favors, support, assuming I would always be there like a wall they could lean on without ever looking back. But walls can move, and foundations can shift, and by the time they realized I was no longer playing the role they assigned me, it would already be too late. Stay with me, because this is not just a story about betrayal. It is about what happens when the man everyone underestimated finally decides to take his life back, and the ending will give you the satisfaction they never thought I deserved. My name is Robert Sinclair. I am 68 years old, a retired structural engineer who spent 4 decades building bridges, hospitals, and office towers across Colorado. I lost my wife Helen 3 years ago to cancer, and since then, I have lived alone in the house we built together, surrounded by memories and the quiet hum of a life that once felt full. It was a Sunday morning in late September when everything I believed about my family began to crumble. The kitchen smelled of fresh coffee and the cinnamon rolls I had picked up from the bakery Helen always loved. I had invited my son Daniel and his wife Claire over for breakfast, something I tried to do at least twice a month. It was my way of staying connected, of reminding myself that I still had family left in this world. Claire arrived first, as she always did, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor with a rhythm that announced her presence before she even spoke. She was 42 years old, blonde, immaculately dressed, even for a casual Sunday breakfast. She kissed my cheek the way one might greet a distant acquaintance, and immediately began rearranging the napkins I had set out, as if my effort was not quite up to her standards. Daniel followed a few steps behind, his shoulders slightly hunched, his eyes already tired though the day had barely begun. My son was 45 now, a man I once carried on my shoulders at county fairs, a boy who used to ask me to check under his bed for monsters. Somewhere along the way, he had become someone I barely recognized. We sat down to eat, and I asked about the vacation. It was a simple question, innocent enough. I had paid for everything. The flights to Hawaii, the resort overlooking the ocean, the rental car, the excursions. Nearly $12,000 in total, a gift I had offered without hesitation because I believed that was what fathers did. They provided, they gave, they made life easier for the people they loved. Claire set down her coffee cup and smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the kind of smile that precedes something sharp. The trip was wonderful, she said. But Robert, I have to be honest, it was really meant to be a trip for family, just the 4 of us. You understand, don't you? I did not understand. I stared at her, waiting for the rest of the sentence, the part where she would clarify or soften what she had just said. But nothing came. She picked up her fork and began cutting into a cinnamon roll as if she had just commented on the weather. I looked at Daniel, my son, my only child. The boy I had worked overtime for, sacrificed vacations for, put through college and graduate school, without asking for a single dollar in return. He sat with his eyes fixed on his coffee cup, stirring it slowly, refusing to meet my gaze. Daniel, I said quietly, is that how you feel too? He did not answer. He just kept stirring, the spoon clinking softly against the ceramic. His silence filled the room like smoke, thick and suffocating. I waited. I gave him every opportunity to say something, anything, to defend me or at least acknowledge that I was sitting right there, that I had paid for the very trip they were discussing. But my son said nothing. Claire continued eating, unbothered. She talked about the beach, the sunsets, how the children had loved the snorkeling. She described the meals, the spa treatments, the evening walks along the shore. She spoke as if I were not in the room, as if I were merely a background fixture, an old piece of furniture that had served its purpose and could now be ignored. I thought about the 30 years I had spent providing for this family, the down payment on Daniel's first house, the wedding I had financed when Claire insisted on a venue that cost more than my first car, the college tuition, the medical bills, the countless checks I had written without complaint because I believed that was what love looked like. I had built my entire life around being useful to them, around being needed. And now, sitting at my own kitchen table, I realized something that made my chest tighten. In Claire's definition of family, I was no longer included. I had become an outsider in my own bloodline, a wallet with a heartbeat, tolerated but not wanted. Daniel finally looked up, just for a moment. Our eyes met, and I saw something in his expression that I could not name. Guilt, perhaps. Or maybe just exhaustion. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again and looked away. That was the first time Robert realized silence could hurt more than words. 2 weeks passed after that Sunday breakfast, and I tried to convince myself that I had misunderstood. Perhaps Claire had not meant it the way it sounded. Perhaps the trip truly had been planned for just the immediate family, and my exclusion was practical rather than personal. I am 68 years old. After all, maybe they thought I would not enjoy the long flights, the heat, the activity. I told myself these things because the alternative was too painful to accept. But late on a Thursday evening, the phone rang, and I learned that I had not misunderstood anything at all. It was Claire. Her voice carried that particular tone she used when she wanted something, a blend of warmth and urgency that I had come to recognize over the years. She asked how I was doing, whether I had been eating well, if the weather had been treating me kindly, small talk that felt rehearsed, like lines from a script she had practiced before dialing. Then she got to the point. "Robert, I hate to ask this, but we have a situation at the house. The contractor came by last week and found some serious issues with the foundation. Water damage, cracks in the basement walls, the whole nightmare. He says if we don't fix it soon, it could affect the entire structure." I listened without interrupting. I had spent 40 years as a structural engineer. I knew what foundation damage looked like, what it cost, and how contractors sometimes exaggerated to inflate their estimates. But I said nothing. I let her continue. "The estimate came in at $15,000, Claire said. "I know it's a lot, and I wouldn't ask if it wasn't absolutely necessary. But Daniel and I just don't have that kind of money right now, not with the kids' school fees and everything else. And I thought, well, you've always been so generous with family." There it was. The word she had used to exclude me just 2 weeks ago was now being deployed to include me, but only for the purpose of writing a check. "Helen would have wanted you to help Daniel," Claire added, her voice softening into something that was meant to sound like compassion. "She always said family takes care of family. I'm sure she's watching over us, hoping we can all support each other through difficult times." I felt something tighten in my chest at the mention of Helen's name. My wife had been gone for 3 years, and hearing Claire invoke her memory as a tool for extraction felt like a small desecration. Helen had been many things: kind, patient, fiercely protective of the people she loved. But she had also been perceptive. She would have seen through this conversation in an instant. "Is Daniel there?" I asked. "I'd like to speak with him." There was a brief pause, the sound of footsteps, murmured words I could not quite make out. Then my son's voice came through the line, flat and distant. "Hey, Dad. Daniel, what's going on with the house? Is the damage really that serious?" Another pause. I could almost hear him choosing his words carefully, measuring each syllable before letting it escape. "Claire's been handling it with the contractor," he said. "I haven't really looked at the details, but if she says it's urgent, I'm sure it is." "And you need $15,000? "I guess so. Whatever you decide, Dad. It's your money." That was all he said. Whatever you decide. No explanation, no gratitude in advance, no acknowledgement that this was a significant sum being requested on short notice. just passive acceptance of whatever outcome I chose, as if my decision had nothing to do with him, as if he were merely a bystander in his own life. I wanted to ask him more. I wanted to demand answers, to understand why my son had become a man who let his wife speak for him, who deferred every difficult conversation, who could not even muster the courage to ask his own father for help directly. But I could hear Claire in the background, waiting, and I knew that any real conversation would have to happen another time, if it happened at all. "I'll transfer the money tomorrow," I said. Claire's voice returned to the phone, bright and relieved. "Oh, Robert, thank you so much. You have no idea how much this means to us. We're so lucky to have you." Lucky. The word sat in my stomach like a stone. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, staring at the phone in my hand. The house was quiet. Helen's absence felt heavier than usual, a silence that pressed against the walls and filled every corner. I thought about all the times I had written checks, transferred funds, handed over cash without question, college tuition for Daniel, the down payment on their first house, the wedding that cost more than my annual salary when I was his age, vacations, cars, private schools for the grandchildren, medical bills that insurance did not cover. Decades of giving, and not once had I stopped to count. I walked to Helen's old desk in the study and opened the drawer where she used to keep her stationery. Inside, I found a leather notebook, the kind she used for household budgets and grocery lists. The pages were blank now, waiting. I sat down, picked up a pen, and began to write. The date, the amount requested, Claire's exact words. "Helen would have wanted you to help Daniel." The duration of the call. Daniel's response. "Whatever you decide, Dad." For the first time in 30 years, I was not just giving, I was documenting. I was paying attention. I was treating my own family the way I had once treated construction projects, with precision, with records, with an eye for details that did not add up. Robert said yes, but this time he was watching. The notebook stayed on my desk for the next several days, its pages slowly filling with dates and figures that told a story I had refused to see for years. But the act of writing, of documenting, stirred something else in me, a restlessness, a need to look backward before I could move forward. And so, on a gray Saturday afternoon when rain tapped gently against the windows, I finally opened the door to Helen's room. I had not touched it since she died. 3 years of walking past that closed door every morning and every night, 3 years of leaving everything exactly as she had left it. Her friends had offered to help me sort through her things. Daniel had suggested, once, that I might consider donating her clothes to charity, but I had refused. The room was a kind of sanctuary, a place where Helen still existed in the arrangement of objects, in the faint traces of her presence that I was terrified to disturb. The curtains were drawn, and the air smelled faintly of dust and something else, something softer, lavender, her perfume. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, letting my eyes adjust to the dim light, letting my heart adjust to the weight of being there. Her reading glasses sat on the nightstand, exactly where she had left them. Thin gold frames, slightly bent on one side because she always fell asleep with a book in her hands. I picked them up and held them carefully, as if they might crumble at my touch. I could still see her wearing them, sitting up in bed with one of her mystery novels, glancing at me over the rims when I said something that amused her. In the dresser, I found her handwritten recipe cards, stacked neatly in a small tin box, decorated with painted roses. Her handwriting was elegant, precise, each letter formed with the care of someone who believed that even grocery lists deserved attention. Chicken pot pie, blueberry cobbler, the beef stew she made every winter that Daniel used to request for his birthday. I flipped through the cards slowly, reading ingredients and instructions that felt like letters from another life. The closet was harder. Her dresses still hung in neat rows, organized by color the way she had always kept them. I ran my hand along the fabric, feeling silk and cotton and wool pass beneath my fingers. Some of these dresses I remembered clearly. The blue one she wore to Daniel's graduation, the green one from our 40th anniversary dinner, the black one she bought for funerals and hoped she would never need. I had not realized how much of a life could be measured in clothing, in the quiet choices a person made every morning about how to present themselves to the world. Behind the dresses, pushed into the far corner of the closet, I found a stack of winter blankets we had not used in years. And behind the blankets, hidden as if someone had deliberately placed it out of sight, I found a box. It was small, perhaps 8 inches long and 5 inches wide, made of dark, polished wood with brass corners. The kind of box that might hold jewelry or important documents. But what caught my attention was the lock. A combination lock, built into the front panel, with 4 small dials that required a specific sequence of numbers to open. I carried the box to the bed and sat down, turning it over in my hands. There was no label, no inscription, nothing to indicate what it contained or why Helen had hidden it so carefully. I tried the obvious combinations first. Our wedding anniversary, June 15th, 1980. The dials clicked into place, but the lock did not release. Her birthday, March 3rd, 1957. Nothing. My birthday. The year we bought this house. The year Daniel was born. None of them worked. I sat there for nearly an hour, trying every significant date I could remember, every number that had ever meant something in our life together. But the box remained locked, its contents hidden, its purpose unknown. That night, I placed the box on my nightstand and lay in bed staring at it until sleep finally pulled me under. And in my dreams, Helen came to me. She stood in our old kitchen, younger than I remembered, her hair still dark, her smile still bright. Sunlight streamed through the window behind her, turning everything golden. She was making coffee, the way she did every morning for 43 years, and when she saw me, she set down the pot and walked toward me. "You found it," she said, not a question, a statement. "I don't know the combination," I told her. "I tried everything." She reached up and touched my face, her palm warm against my cheek. "You'll know when you're ready," she said softly. "When the time is right, you'll know." I woke with a start, the room dark, my heart pounding. The box sat on the nightstand exactly where I had left it, its brass corners catching the faint light from the window. I reached out and touched it, half expecting it to feel different somehow, to have changed in the night. But it was just wood and metal, solid and real and utterly silent. I did not know what Helen had left for me. I did not know why she had hidden it or what secret it contained. But lying there in the darkness, still feeling the warmth of her hand on my face, I understood one thing with absolute certainty. The box held no label, but Robert felt certain it was meant for him. The dream stayed with me for days. Helen's voice, soft and certain, echoing through my waking hours. "You'll know when you're ready." I kept the box on my nightstand, looking at it each morning when I woke, and each night before I slept, as if proximity alone might reveal its secrets. But the lock remained fastened, the combination still a mystery, and I began to wonder if I would ever be ready for whatever truth waited inside. On Wednesday afternoon, Margaret Lewis called to invite me for tea. This was not unusual. She had been extending these invitations every week since moving into the house 3 doors down, about 2 years ago now. Margaret was 70 years old, a retired nurse with silver hair and kind eyes that seemed to notice everything. She had arrived in the neighborhood shortly after Helen's death, and though I was not in the mood for new friendships at the time, her quiet persistence had eventually worn down my resistance. Our weekly teas had become a small comfort, a brief interruption in the solitude that otherwise defined my days. I walked to her house that afternoon with the autumn wind pulling at my jacket. Leaves skittered across the sidewalk in shades of red and gold, and the sky hung low and gray, threatening rain that never quite arrived. Margaret greeted me at the door with her usual warm smile, ushering me into her living room where a pot of Earl Grey already waited on the small table between 2 armchairs. We talked about ordinary things at first. The weather, the neighborhood association's latest complaints about parking, a book she had been reading about the history of Colorado mining towns. Margaret had a way of making small talk feel meaningful, of listening as if every word mattered. It was one of the things I appreciated most about her company. But then, as she poured my second cup of tea, she asked a question that made me set down my cup and stare at her. "Robert, did Helen ever talk to you about her childhood? About her family, I mean. Any siblings she might have had?" The question landed strangely in the quiet room. I turned it over in my mind, trying to understand why Margaret would ask such a thing. Why now? Why in that particular tone that suggested she already knew something I did not? "Helen didn't talk much about her past," I said carefully. "She told me once, early in our marriage, that she had no family left. Her parents died when she was young. She said she was raised by an aunt who passed away before we met. I never pressed her for details. She seemed to prefer looking forward rather than backward. Margaret nodded slowly, her eyes fixed on her teacup. She never mentioned a sister or a brother? No, never. Helen was very clear that she was alone in the world when I met her. It was one of the reasons she valued our family so much. I paused, studying Margaret's face. Why are you asking me this? She did not answer immediately. Instead, she stood and walked to the window, looking out at the gray afternoon as if searching for words in the clouds. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than before. I suppose some questions stay locked away until the right moment, she said, just like some boxes. I felt my breath catch. What did you say? Margaret turned to face me, and I saw something in her expression that I had never noticed before. A weight, a knowledge that did not belong to a casual neighbor, a weekly tea companion. The box you found, she said, in Helen's closet. She always said you would find it when you were ready. I stood up so quickly that my teacup rattled against its saucer. How do you know about the box? I haven't told anyone about it. I only found it a few days ago. Margaret held my gaze without flinching. Helen and I talked, before she passed. More than you knew, more than she wanted you to know at the time. That's impossible. I was with her every day in those final months. I would have known if she was meeting with someone, confiding in someone. Not every conversation happens in person, Robert. And not every truth gets shared in the moment it's discovered. She walked past me toward the door, signaling that our tea was over, that the conversation had reached a boundary she was not yet willing to cross. I've said more than I should. The rest isn't mine to tell. I followed her to the door, my mind spinning with questions I did not know how to ask. At the threshold, I stopped and turned to face her. Margaret, please. If you know something about Helen, about that box, about any of this, I need to understand. She was my wife for 43 years. I thought I knew everything about her. Margaret looked at me with an expression that was equal parts compassion and resolve. She reached out and placed her hand briefly on my arm, a gesture that felt almost maternal. Are you sure you know everything about your own wife, Robert? Margaret's question followed me home like a shadow I could not shake. Are you sure you know everything about your own wife? The words played on a loop in my mind as I walked back through the falling dusk, leaves crunching beneath my feet, the autumn air sharp against my face. I had been married to Helen for 43 years. I had held her hand through joy and sorrow, through the birth of our son and the slow decline of her health. I had believed, with the certainty of decades, that I knew her completely. Now that certainty felt like sand slipping through my fingers. When I reached home, I did not turn on the television or pour myself a drink or settle into my usual evening routine. Instead, I walked directly to the study, to the heavy oak desk where Helen and I had managed the practical details of our life together. In the corner of the room stood a fireproof safe, gray and solid, installed 30 years ago when we first bought this house. It held our most important documents: birth certificates, the deed to our property, insurance policies, the paperwork that formed the legal architecture of a shared existence. I knelt before the safe and turned the dial, the combination still committed to memory after all these years. The door swung open with a familiar click, and I began removing folders, one by one, spreading them across the desk in the lamplight. The first folder contained our house deed, dated 1984, the year we moved into this home. I remembered signing those papers with Helen beside me, both of us giddy with the enormity of what we were doing, buying our forever home, planting roots that we believed would last a lifetime. The second folder held our investment accounts, statements going back decades, charting the slow accumulation of savings that were meant to carry us through retirement and beyond. But it was the third folder that made me pause. Inside, I found a thick stack of legal documents, bound together with a faded rubber band. The cover page read, Sinclair Family Revocable Living Trust, established in 2005. I remembered this. Helen had insisted we create the trust after a colleague of mine died suddenly, and his family spent years fighting over his estate. She had been adamant that we protect ourselves, protect Daniel, ensure that our assets would pass smoothly without the chaos of probate. I began reading through the documents more carefully than I had in years. The trust was comprehensive, covering everything we owned: the house, the investment accounts, the retirement funds, even the small vacation property we had purchased in the mountains and later sold. And there, on page 7, I found my name listed as the sole trustee. Helen had been co-trustee while she lived, But upon her death, full control had passed to me. No one else. Not Daniel. Certainly not Claire. I read the paragraph twice, then a third time, making sure I understood what it meant. The trust had never been dissolved. It had never been modified. Every asset we had accumulated over 40 years remained under my exclusive control, requiring my explicit approval for any transfer, sale, or distribution. Claire had spent years acting as if she had some claim to our family's finances. She spoke about money as if it were already hers, as if my role was simply to approve her decisions and sign whatever checks she requested. But legally, she had access to nothing. Every dollar I had given her, every payment I had made on her behalf, had been a gift, not an obligation. I owed her nothing, and she controlled nothing. I sat back in my chair, stunned by the clarity of what I was seeing. For years, I had operated under an assumption that turned out to be entirely false. I had believed that my generosity was expected, perhaps even required. I had never stopped to examine the actual legal reality of my situation. Helen had built a fortress around our assets, and I had never realized it was there. At the bottom of the folder, tucked behind the final page of the trust document, I found a small envelope. My name was written on the front in Helen's handwriting, the letters neat and familiar. Inside was a single sheet of notepaper, folded once. "Robert," the note began. "If you're reading this, something has happened that made you go looking for answers. I hope I'm wrong about what I suspect, but I've learned to trust my instincts over the years. If you ever need help understanding what I've set up, or if you need someone you can trust absolutely, call Thomas Reed. He knows everything. He helped me put this together, and he promised to help you if the time ever came." Below her signature was a phone number, written in the same careful hand. Thomas Reed. The name surfaced from memory like a stone rising through water. He was an estate attorney, someone Helen had insisted we use when we created the trust nearly 20 years ago. I remembered him as a quiet man with gray eyes and a meticulous way of explaining legal details. We had exchanged Christmas cards for a few years after the trust was finalized, but I had not spoken to him since Helen's funeral, when he had pressed my hand and told me to call if I ever needed anything. I looked at the phone number for a long time. Outside, darkness had fully settled over the neighborhood, and the house felt very quiet around me. The box on my nightstand remained locked. Margaret's question still echoed in my ears, and now Helen's voice joined the chorus, reaching out from beyond the grave with instructions I had never known existed. I reached for the telephone on my desk, feeling the weight of it in my hand, and began to dial. Robert picked up the phone after 3 years of silence. The phone rang twice before a voice answered, calm and measured, as if the man on the other end had been expecting this call for a very long time. Thomas Reed speaking. "Thomas, this is Robert Sinclair, Helen's husband. I don't know if you remember me, but I remember you, Robert." There was no hesitation in his voice, no surprise. "Helen said you'd call eventually. I've been waiting." I gripped the phone tighter, my knuckles whitening. "What do you mean she said I'd call? Helen's been gone for 3 years. "I know exactly how long it's been," Thomas replied. "And I know this call means something has happened, something that made you start looking for answers." He paused, and I heard him take a breath. "She gave me something for you. A combination, 4 numbers. She said when the time came, you'd know what it was for." My eyes drifted to the bedroom doorway, toward the nightstand where the wooden box had waited for days, its lock resisting every number I had tried. "What are the numbers?" My voice came out barely above a whisper. 9, 3, 0, 7. I wrote them down with a trembling hand, though I knew I would not forget them. What do they mean? I tried every date I could think of. Our anniversary, her birthday, everything. "It's not a date," Thomas said quietly. "It's the day she received her diagnosis, September 7th. The day she found out she was dying. She told me that was the day she stopped being afraid of the future and started preparing for it." I could not speak. The numbers stared back at me from the notepad, innocent and terrible. "Robert, whatever you find in that box, know that Helen did it out of love. She was protecting you the only way she knew how." Thomas cleared his throat. "If you need me after you've seen what's inside, call me any time, day or night." I promised her I'd be here for you. I thanked him, though the words felt hollow in my mouth, and ended the call. For several minutes, I sat motionless in the study, the silence of the house pressing against me like a physical weight. Then I rose and walked to the bedroom. The box sat exactly where I had left it, its dark wood gleaming faintly in the lamplight. I picked it up and turned the dials with fingers that refused to stop shaking. 9, 3, 0, 7. The lock clicked open. Inside, nestled in a bed of dark velvet, lay a single USB drive. A small white label was affixed to its surface, and on it, in Helen's handwriting, were the words, "For Robert. Open when you're ready to see the truth." I carried the drive to my laptop like a man carrying something sacred. The computer hummed to life, and I inserted the USB into the port, watching as a single folder appeared on the screen. Inside were several files, documents, scanned images, what appeared to be screenshots of emails. But one file stood apart from the others, a video file named simply "Watch First." I clicked on it, and Helen's face filled the screen. She looked thinner than I remembered, the cancer already carving hollows beneath her cheekbones, but her eyes were sharp and clear. She sat at her desk in the study, the same desk where I had found the trust documents just hours ago, and she looked directly into the camera as if she could see me watching from 3 years in the future. "Hello, my love," she began, and her voice broke something open inside my chest. "If you're watching this, then the time has come. Something has happened to make you question things, to make you look for answers I couldn't give you while I was alive." She paused, gathering herself, and I saw her hands tremble slightly before she steadied them against the desk. "I've watched Claire for years, Robert. I know what she is. I know what she's planning. I've seen the way she looks at our finances, the way she speaks to you when she thinks I'm not listening, the way she's slowly been isolating Daniel from everyone who might tell him the truth about his own marriage." Helen's voice hardened. "She's been waiting for me to die so she can take everything we built. And she's been waiting for you to grow old enough that no one will believe you when you try to fight back." I felt the blood drain from my face. "I couldn't tell you while I was alive because you wouldn't have believed me. You've always wanted to see the best in people, especially in Daniel's choices. It's one of the things I love most about you, but it's also your blind spot." She leaned closer to the camera, so I prepared. "Everything you need is in this drive. Documented incidents of her manipulation, emails she sent to Daniel that prove what she really thinks of you, financial records showing how she's been positioning herself to take control." Helen sat back, and her expression softened. "I also made sure she can never touch what's ours. Thomas Reed is named as successor trustee if anything happens to you. If you become incapacitated, if someone tries to declare you incompetent, Thomas takes over. Not Daniel, not Claire. She has no path to our assets, Robert." I closed every door. Tears were streaming down my face now, falling onto the keyboard, blurring my vision. "I'm sorry I couldn't be there to fight beside you," Helen continued, "but I'm fighting for you now, the only way I still can. Everything I did because I love you, because I couldn't bear the thought of leaving you unprotected." She smiled, and it was the same smile I had fallen in love with 45 years ago. "Be strong, my darling, and when you're ready, find Margaret. She'll explain the rest." The video ended, and the screen went dark. I sat in the silence of our home, surrounded by the evidence of my wife's final gift, and understood at last what she had done. Every secret, every preparation, every careful step she had taken in the shadow of her own death had been for me. Helen wasn't just his wife. She was his guardian angel, even from beyond the grave. I spent 3 days reviewing everything Helen had left me. The emails, the documents, the careful records she had compiled over years of quiet observation. Each piece of evidence confirmed what she had told me in the video. Claire had been playing a long game, positioning herself to control our family's finances, waiting for the right moment to make her move. But as damning as the evidence was, one question haunted me more than all the others. Where was Daniel in all of this? My son's name appeared throughout Helen's files, but always as a peripheral figure, someone being manipulated rather than someone doing the manipulating. Claire spoke about him in her emails with a casual contempt that made my stomach turn, referring to him as manageable and too weak to cause problems. She had written to a friend that Daniel would do whatever I tell him as long as I keep his secret safe. But what secret? Helen's files offered no answer, and the question burned in my mind like an ember that refused to go out. I needed to see my son, not with Claire present, controlling the conversation, steering every word. I needed to speak to Daniel alone, father to son, and give him one chance to tell me the truth. I called him on a Tuesday morning, keeping my voice casual, unthreatening. Daniel, I was hoping we could have dinner this week, just the two of us. There's a new Italian place downtown I've been wanting to try. There was a pause on the line, long enough that I wondered if he would refuse. But then he said, "Sure, Dad. How about Thursday?" We met at the restaurant at 7 o'clock. It was a quiet place with white tablecloths and soft lighting, the kind of establishment Helen and I used to visit for anniversaries and special occasions. Daniel arrived looking tired, dark circles under his eyes, his shoulders carrying a weight I had not noticed before. He smiled when he saw me, but the smile did not reach his eyes. We ordered our food and talked about safe things at first, his work at the accounting firm, the weather, a movie he had seen recently with the children. I let him steer the conversation, watching him carefully, noting the way his hands fidgeted with his napkin, the way his gaze kept drifting toward the door, as if he expected someone to walk in at any moment. When our meals arrived, I set down my fork and looked at my son, really looked at him, the way I had not allowed myself to look in years. I saw a man who was 45 years old, but seemed somehow older, worn down by something invisible, something he carried alone. "Daniel," I said gently, "is everything okay at home?" His fork stopped halfway to his mouth. He set it down slowly, deliberately, and I watched the color drain from his face. "What do you mean?" His voice was careful, guarded. "I mean exactly what I asked. Is everything okay? With you, with Claire, with your life?" I reached across the table and placed my hand over his. "You can tell me anything, son. Whatever it is, whatever's going on. I'm your father. I love you. Nothing you say will change that." Daniel's hands began to shake. I felt the tremor beneath my palm, a vibration that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside him. His eyes reddened, and for a moment I thought he might cry. "Dad, please," his voice cracked. "Please don't ask me that." "Why not?" "Daniel, I can see something is wrong. I've been able to see it for years, but I kept telling myself it wasn't my place to interfere. I kept waiting for you to come to me." I squeezed his hand. "I'm not waiting anymore. Tell me what's happening." He pulled his hand away and pressed both palms flat against the table, as if trying to steady himself against an earthquake only he could feel. His jaw tightened. His breath came faster. "I can't, Dad." The words came out strangled, barely audible. I can't. Can't or won't." He looked at me then, and what I saw in his eyes broke my heart. It was not defiance. It was not resentment or anger or any of the things I might have expected. It was fear. Pure, undiluted fear. The kind that paralyzes a person, that locks them in place even when they desperately want to move. "There are things you don't understand," he whispered. "Things I've done, mistakes I've made. If I tell you, everything falls apart. Everything. Daniel, whatever you've done, we can face it together. That's what family is for." He shook his head, pushing back from the table, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. Other diners glanced our way, curious, concerned. Daniel did not seem to notice. "I'm sorry, Dad, I'm so sorry." He was standing now, reaching for his coat, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. "I shouldn't have come. This was a mistake." "Daniel, wait." But he was already walking away, weaving between tables, heading for the door. I watched him go, my half-eaten meal growing cold in front of me, my hand still extended toward the empty chair where my son had been sitting moments before. The waiter approached cautiously, asking if everything was all right. I told him yes, everything was fine. Please bring the check. But nothing was fine. My son was drowning in something I could not see, trapped by a weight I could not lift, and he had just walked away from the only lifeline I knew how to offer. I paid the bill and sat alone at that white-clothed table for a long time, watching the candle flicker in its glass holder, thinking about all the years I had waited for Daniel to choose me, to stand up to Claire, to be the son I remembered from before his marriage, the young man who used to ask my advice and trust my judgment. That Daniel was still in there somewhere. I had seen him tonight, fighting to break free, desperate to speak. But something held him back, something stronger than love, stronger than loyalty, stronger than the bond between a father and his only child. That was when Robert stopped waiting for his son to choose him. The weeks that followed my failed dinner with Daniel took on a strange, watchful quality. I continued my routine, tending to the house, taking my morning walks, meeting Margaret for our weekly tea. But beneath the surface of ordinary life, I was observing everything with new eyes. Helen's files had taught me to look for patterns, to notice the small details that reveal larger truths. And what I saw in Claire's behavior confirmed everything my wife had warned me about. Her spending had become reckless, almost theatrical in its excess. I learned about the new car first, a silver Mercedes that appeared in their driveway one Sunday afternoon when I stopped by unannounced. Claire had waved her hand dismissively when I asked about it, explaining that her old vehicle had been unreliable and that she deserved something appropriate for someone in her position. What position that might be, she did not clarify. The car cost more than many people earn in a year, and she spoke about it as casually as one might discuss a new pair of shoes. Then came the designer bags. I noticed them during a family dinner at their house, lined up in the entryway closet when I went to hang my coat. Leather and silk and hardware that gleamed like jewelry, each one bearing logos I recognized from the advertisements Helen used to skip past in her magazines. There must have been a dozen of them, maybe more, arranged with the careful precision of a museum display. The spa retreat was mentioned in passing, a week-long stay at some exclusive resort in Arizona that Claire described as essential for her mental health. She had returned with a tan and a new set of complaints about the difficulty of finding good service these days, apparently unaware of the irony in criticizing service workers while spending thousands of dollars on luxury treatments. Through all of this, Claire never once asked where the money came from. She never questioned how a retired engineer could afford to fund her lifestyle, never wondered whether the well might eventually run dry. In her mind, I was an inexhaustible resource, a fountain of wealth that existed solely to satisfy her desires. The possibility that I might have limits or boundaries or a will of my own seemed never to have crossed her mind. I discovered the depth of her entitlement quite by accident. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I had come to their house to drop off a birthday gift for my grandson. The front door was unlocked, so I let myself in, calling out a greeting that went unanswered. I assumed everyone was in the backyard, but as I walked through the hallway toward the kitchen, I heard Claire's voice drifting from the living room. She was on the phone, her tone light and conspiratorial, the way people speak when they believe they are completely alone. I know, she was saying, but honestly, it's just a matter of time. The old man won't last forever. He's 68, lives alone, eats whatever he wants. How much longer can he really go? She laughed, a bright, careless sound that made my blood run cold. We just need to wait it out. Another few years, maybe less if we're lucky. Then everything will be ours. The house, the investments, all of it. Daniel's the only heir, and Daniel does what I tell him. I stood frozen in the hallway, my grandson's wrapped gift clutched in my hands, listening to my daughter-in-law discuss my death as though it were a business opportunity. She continued talking, describing plans for renovation, for travel, for a lifestyle that would finally match her ambitions. Not once did she mention grief. Not once did she acknowledge that she was speaking about a human being, a father, a man who had done nothing but try to help her family. I left the gift on the hallway table and walked out the front door without making a sound. She never knew I had been there. But Claire was not the only one whose behavior had changed. Daniel, too, had become someone I barely recognized, though in his case the transformation manifested as anxiety rather than arrogance. I noticed it during subsequent visits, the way he excused himself to take phone calls in other rooms, the hushed tones of his voice when he thought no one was listening, the nervous glances over his shoulder as though he expected to be caught at something. Claire dismissed his behavior as work stress, claiming the accounting firm had been pressuring him with impossible deadlines. But I watched my son more carefully than she realized, and what I saw did not look like professional pressure. It looked like fear. The same fear I had seen at the restaurant, the same desperate, cornered expression of a man who was hiding something he could not bear to reveal. I began to wonder if Daniel had gotten himself into financial trouble. Perhaps he had made bad investments, accumulated debts he could not repay, borrowed money from the wrong people. It would explain the secret phone calls, the constant anxiety, the way he seemed to flinch whenever Claire mentioned money. I had seen men destroyed by debt before. Good men who made one wrong decision and spent years trying to dig themselves out. The thought that my son might be drowning in financial problems while his wife spent money like water made something harden inside my chest. But I did not confront him. Not yet. I had learned from Helen's files that patience was a weapon, that the truth reveals itself to those who know how to wait. And so I waited, watching Claire's confidence grow with each passing week, watching Daniel's anxiety deepen, watching the cracks in their marriage spread like fractures in a foundation that had been poorly laid from the start. Claire never asked where the money truly came from. That was her first mistake. The morning after I overheard Claire's phone call, I sat at my desk and drafted a letter. It was not a dramatic document, not an accusation or a threat. It was simply a new set of financial guidelines, written in the calm, precise language I had used throughout my engineering career when establishing protocols for complex projects. I had learned long ago that the most effective structures are built quietly, one carefully placed component at a time. The letter explained that, effective immediately, any request for financial assistance exceeding $500 would require itemized receipts and my written approval before funds would be transferred. I cited my age and the importance of maintaining clear records for estate planning purposes. I mentioned that my accountant had recommended these procedures as a matter of good financial hygiene. Nowhere in the letter did I accuse anyone of anything. Nowhere did I suggest that I had overheard conversations or reviewed hidden files. I simply established boundaries, politely and firmly, as any reasonable person might do with their own money. I mailed the letter on a Thursday. By Saturday afternoon, Claire was standing in my living room, her face flushed with barely contained fury. "This is insulting," she said, waving the letter in front of her like a weapon. "You're treating us like children, Robert, like we can't be trusted with a single dollar without your permission." I remained seated in my armchair, my hands folded calmly in my lap. I had expected this visit. I had prepared for it. "I'm treating my money like my money," I said. "That shouldn't surprise anyone. These are reasonable precautions for a man my age." "Reasonable? Itemized receipts? Written approval? Do you have any idea how humiliating this is?" "I'm not sure why tracking expenses would be humiliating unless there's something about those expenses you'd prefer I didn't see." Claire opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again. For a moment, something flickered across her face, a shadow of uncertainty that I had never seen there before. She was accustomed to dealing with a different version of me, the version that said yes without question, that wrote checks without conditions, that prioritized family harmony over his own dignity. That version no longer existed. "Daniel and I have always been responsible with money," she said, but her voice had lost some of its edge. "Then you'll have no trouble providing receipts." She stared at me, searching my face for something, perhaps the weakness she had always relied upon, the desire to avoid conflict that had made me so easy to manage. But whatever she was looking for, she did not find it. What she saw instead was clarity, the unshakable calm of a man who finally understood the game being played against him. "This isn't over," she said quietly. "I didn't imagine it was." She left without another word, the front door closing behind her with a force that rattled the windows. I sat in the silence that followed, feeling something I had not felt in a very long time. Not anger, not triumph, but something quieter, control. For the first time in years, I was the one setting the terms. That evening, I walked to Margaret's house for our usual tea. The autumn air had turned crisp, carrying the scent of wood smoke and fallen leaves. Margaret greeted me at the door with her customary warmth, ushering me into her living room where a pot of chamomile was already steeping. We talked for a while about ordinary things, the changing season, a book she had been reading, the antics of a neighborhood cat that had taken to sleeping on her porch. But my attention kept drifting to a photograph I had not noticed before, sitting on a shelf near the window. It showed two young women, perhaps in their early 20s, their arms around each other, laughing at something outside the frame. The photograph was old, its colors slightly faded, but something about one of the women made my heart stop. She looked exactly like Helen. The same dark hair, the same bright eyes, the same smile that had captivated me the first time I saw it across a crowded lecture hall more than 4 decades ago. "Margaret," I said slowly, "who are the women in that photograph?" She turned to look at where I was pointing, and I saw her body stiffen, almost imperceptibly. In 2 quick steps, she crossed the room and picked up the frame, holding it against her chest as though protecting it from scrutiny. "Old memories," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "Nothing important, One of them looks like Helen, when she was young. Margaret did not meet my eyes. She opened a drawer and placed the photograph inside, closing it with a soft click that felt louder than it should have. Some stories aren't ready to be told yet, Robert. You'll understand soon enough. I wanted to press her, to demand answers, to insist that she explain the connection between herself and my late wife that seemed to deepen with every passing week. But something in her expression stopped me. There was no deception in her face, only a kind of patient sorrow, the look of someone carrying a weight she was not yet permitted to set down. Helen's video mentioned you, I said. She told me to find you when I was ready. I've found you, Margaret, but I still don't understand why. She looked at me then, her eyes glistening in the lamplight. You will. When all the pieces are in place, you will. I left her house that evening with more questions than answers, the image of that photograph burning in my mind. Two young women, arms intertwined, frozen in a moment of joy that predated everything I thought I knew about my wife's history. Back home, I sat in the darkness of my study and thought about Claire's fury, about Margaret's secrets, about the walls closing in on a truth that had been hidden for decades. Somewhere in the distance, I heard the sound of a car engine starting, probably Claire driving away from another fruitless attempt to regain the control she had once taken for granted. Claire realized control was slipping, but she didn't know from whose hands. The effects of my new financial rules became visible faster than I had anticipated. Within 3 weeks, the carefully constructed facade of Claire's lifestyle began to show cracks. I learned about the missed credit card payments through Daniel, who called me one evening sounding exhausted and defeated. He did not ask for money directly, which told me Claire had probably forbidden him from appearing weak. Instead, he spoke vaguely about cash flow challenges and temporary adjustments, his voice hollow with the effort of maintaining dignity he no longer possessed. I visited their house unannounced on a Sunday afternoon, something I had begun doing more frequently since instituting my new guidelines. The Mercedes still sat in the driveway, but I noticed a thin layer of dust on its hood, as though it had not been driven in days. Inside, the atmosphere felt different, tighter. The designer bags no longer lined the entryway closet. Several rooms that had once been immaculate now showed signs of neglect. Dishes in the sink, mail piling up on the counter, curtains that remained drawn against the afternoon sun. Claire was not home, which suited my purposes perfectly. Daniel sat alone in the living room, staring at nothing, his face pale and drawn. He looked as though he had not slept in weeks. When he saw me, he attempted a smile that faltered before it fully formed. "Dad, I didn't know you were coming. I wanted to check on you," I said, settling into the chair across from him. "You don't look well, son." He ran a hand through his hair, a nervous gesture I remembered from his childhood when he was struggling with a problem he could not solve. "It's been a difficult month. Work has been demanding. Claire's been..." He trailed off, unable or unwilling to finish the sentence. "Claire's been what?" Before he could answer, the front door opened, and Claire swept in, her arms full of shopping bags that contradicted everything Daniel had just implied about their financial difficulties. She stopped when she saw me, her expression hardening into something between surprise and resentment. "Robert." "What a pleasant surprise." The words were polite. The tone was not. "I was just checking on Daniel. He seems tired." Claire dropped the bags on the floor with a thud that made Daniel flinch. "Of course he's tired. He's been dealing with the stress your new rules have created. Do you have any idea what you've done to this family? I've asked for receipts before approving expenses. That hardly seems catastrophic. Your father is ruining us." She spun toward Daniel, her voice rising. "Do something. Talk to him. Make him understand that we can't live like this." Daniel shrank into the couch cushions, his eyes darting between his wife and his father like a trapped animal seeking escape. "Claire, please. Not now." "Then when? When we lose the house? When they repossess the car?" She laughed bitterly. "He sits in his big empty house with all his money, playing games with our lives, and you just let him." I watched my son absorb her words like blows, each accusation landing visibly on his shoulders. The man before me was not the confident boy I had raised, not the promising young accountant who had once talked excitedly about his future. He was a shell, hollowed out by years of pressure I was only beginning to understand. Later that evening, after Claire had stormed upstairs and the house had fallen into uneasy silence, I found myself alone with Daniel in the kitchen. He was making coffee with trembling hands, spilling grounds across the counter without seeming to notice. "Daniel," I said quietly, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." He stiffened but did not turn around. "I've been reviewing some financial records, yours specifically. I noticed you've been sending $2,000 every month to a company in Nevada. Have been for years." I paused, watching the back of his head. "What is that about?" The coffee pot clattered against the counter. Daniel gripped the edge of the sink, his knuckles white. "It's nothing, Dad. Just some old obligations. Business debts from years ago. Nothing to worry about. $2,000 a month for years doesn't sound like nothing." He turned to face me, and I saw tears forming in his eyes. "Please, Dad. Just leave it alone. I'm handling it." "Are you in trouble? Financial trouble? Because if you are, I can help. But I need to know the truth." His mouth opened, then closed. For a moment, I thought he might finally tell me everything, might finally unburden himself of whatever secret was crushing him from the inside. But then his expression shuddered, the walls slamming back into place. "Dad," he whispered, "did you change something? With the finances? With the trust? Did you do something I don't know about?" The question surprised me. "Why do you ask?" "Because Claire's been acting strange, paranoid. She keeps saying something feels different, that you're not the same person you used to be." His voice trembled, but not from anger, from fear. "She's scared, Dad, and when Claire's scared, she's dangerous." "Dad, did you change something?" Daniel's voice trembled, but not from anger, from fear. Daniel's warning about Claire echoed in my mind as I walked to Margaret's house the following afternoon. "She's scared, Dad, and when Claire's scared, she's dangerous." My son's fear had been palpable, a living thing that filled the space between us, but I could not help him until I understood the full picture, and too many pieces of that picture remained hidden in Margaret's careful silences. She answered the door with her usual warm smile, but something in my expression must have told her this was not a social visit. Her smile faltered slightly as she stepped aside to let me in. "Robert, I wasn't expecting you until Wednesday, I know, but I couldn't wait any longer." I walked past her into the living room, my eyes immediately finding the shelf where the photograph had sat before she hastily removed it. The space was empty now, occupied only by a small porcelain vase. "The photograph, Margaret, the one you hid from me last time I was here." She closed the door slowly, her back to me, her hand lingering on the knob. "I was wondering when you'd ask about that. The woman in that picture was Helen. I would recognize her anywhere, at any age. She was my wife for 43 years. I turned to face her. "Why do you have a photograph of Helen as a young woman? And why did you try to hide it from me?" Margaret remained motionless for a long moment. Then she sighed, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of decades, and walked to her desk in the corner of the room. She opened a drawer and withdrew an envelope, its edges worn soft with age and handling. Without a word, she crossed the room and placed it in my hands. The envelope was addressed simply, "Margaret." The handwriting was Helen's. I would have known it anywhere. The graceful loops and careful strokes that had filled 40 years of birthday cards, grocery lists, and love notes left on my pillow. "Open it," Margaret said quietly. I slid my finger beneath the flap and withdrew a single sheet of paper, folded twice. The letter was dated 5 years ago, the year Helen received her diagnosis. My hands trembled as I began to read. "My dearest sister," the letter began, "I'm sorry for 20 years of silence. I was wrong about everything. The money, the inheritance, none of it mattered the way I thought it did. Pride is a terrible thing, and mine cost me the only family I had left. Please forgive me." I looked up at Margaret, my mind struggling to process what I was reading. "Sister?" She nodded, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "Keep reading. I'm sick now. The doctors say I have time, but not as much as I'd hoped. And there are things I need to set right before I go. Robert is a good man, the best man I've ever known. But he's too trusting, too willing to see the best in people, even when they don't deserve it. Claire has been circling our family for years, waiting for her moment. I've done what I can to protect him legally, but he's going to need someone watching over him after I'm gone. Someone who loves him, someone I trust. Please, Margaret, move to Colorado. Be near him. Don't tell him who you are until the time is right. Just be his friend, his neighbor, someone he can turn to when things get hard. He's going to need you more than he knows. Your sister, Helen." I lowered the letter, my vision blurring. Margaret stood before me, her face streaked with tears that mirrored my own. "We were close once," she said softly. "Growing up, we were inseparable. But our parents died when Helen was 22, and they left everything to me as the eldest. It wasn't fair, but it was how things were done in those days. Helen felt betrayed. We fought, said terrible things to each other, and then we just stopped speaking. She never told me she had a sister," I whispered. "She was ashamed of the fight, of her own stubbornness. She'd built a new life with you, and she didn't want to taint it with old wounds." Margaret reached out and took my hand. "When she got sick, she tracked me down. She said she needed to make things right before she died, and she asked me to do this one thing for her, to watch over you." 2 years, I said. "You've been here for 2 years. Every cup of tea, every conversation, all of it was real, Robert. I came here because Helen asked me to, but I stayed because I grew to care about you. You're the man my sister loved. Watching over you hasn't been a burden. It's been an honor." I looked down at the letter still clutched in my hands, Helen's final gift wrapped in words I had never expected to read. She had anticipated everything, the danger, the loneliness, the need for someone I could trust, and in her methodical, loving way, she had provided for all of it. "She planned everything," I said, my voice breaking. Even from her deathbed, she was still taking care of me. Margaret squeezed my hand. "That's who she was, Robert. That's who she always was." I stood in that small living room, surrounded by the evidence of my wife's enduring love, and felt something shift inside my chest. For 3 years, I had believed myself alone in the world, abandoned by my son, targeted by my daughter-in-law, left to navigate the darkness without a guide. But I had been wrong. Robert wasn't alone after all. Helen had made sure of that. The revelation about Margaret stayed with me through the following days, reshaping everything I thought I knew about my life and my marriage. Helen had built an invisible fortress around me, brick by careful brick, and I had walked through its corridors for years without ever recognizing the architecture. But even as I marveled at my wife's foresight, another piece of the puzzle remained unsolved: Daniel. His fear, his secrets, the monthly payments to a company that did not exist. Whatever truth he was hiding, I sensed it was connected to everything else. The answer came 3 nights later, at 11 o'clock, when a knock at my front door pulled me from restless sleep. I found Daniel standing on my porch, illuminated by the pale glow of the porch light. He looked worse than I had ever seen him. His clothes were wrinkled, his hair uncombed, his eyes red-rimmed and swollen. He had been crying, perhaps for hours, and his hands shook as he stood there in the cold autumn air. "Dad," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I need to tell you something. I should have told you years ago." I stepped aside without a word and let him in. He walked past me into the living room and sank onto the couch, his head falling into his hands. I sat across from him and waited, giving him the space to find whatever words he had been carrying for so long. When he finally looked up, his face was wet with fresh tears. 8 years ago, he began. Claire was traveling for work, a conference in Seattle, 2 weeks long. We had been fighting a lot back then, about money, about her expectations, about everything. I was lonely and angry, and I made a terrible mistake. I said nothing. I simply listened. There was a woman, a colleague at the firm. We had a brief affair, just a few weeks, and then Claire came home and I ended it. I thought that was the end of it. He laughed bitterly, but it wasn't. A few months later, the woman contacted me. She was pregnant. She wanted me to know, even though she didn't expect anything from me. She said she was keeping the baby. My heart clenched. "You have another child?" "A daughter." The word came out broken. "Her name is Emma. She's 7 years old now. I've never met her, Dad. Not once. But I've been supporting her since the day she was born. The money I send every month, the company in Nevada you asked about, it's a trust fund I set up for her. It's the only thing I could do. The only way I could be any kind of father to a child I can never acknowledge." I sat in silence, processing this revelation. My son had a daughter I had never known about, a granddaughter. Somewhere in Nevada, a little girl was growing up without knowing that her father thought about her every single day. "Does Claire know?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. Daniel's face twisted with anguish. She found out 5 years ago. I don't know how. Maybe she went through my bank statements. Maybe she hired someone to investigate. It doesn't matter. What matters is what she did with the information. What did she do? She weaponized it. His voice hardened with a bitterness I had never heard from him before. She told me that if I ever stood against her, if I ever questioned her decisions or sided with you or did anything she didn't approve of, she would tell everyone. You, her friends, my colleagues, everyone. She said she would destroy my reputation, end my career, make sure I never worked in accounting again. She said she would tell Mom before she died. The cruelty of it took my breath away. Claire had discovered my son's deepest shame and turned it into a leash, a weapon she could use to control every aspect of his life. That's why you've been so passive, I said slowly. That's why you never defended me, never stood up to her. You weren't choosing her over me. You were protecting yourself from her. I've been her prisoner for 5 years, Dad. Tears streamed down his face. Every time I wanted to speak up, every time I wanted to help you or fight back, she reminded me of what she could do. I've been living in terror, watching her take more and more from you, hating myself for being too weak to stop it. I rose from my chair and crossed to the couch, sitting beside my son and pulling him into an embrace. He collapsed against me, sobbing like the child he had once been. You're not weak, I said firmly. You made a mistake, and you've been paying for it ever since. But being afraid doesn't make you a coward, Daniel. Staying silent to protect yourself from a predator doesn't make you complicit in her crimes. What do I do now? He whispered. Now we fight back, together. I held my son in the quiet of my living room, feeling the weight of his confession settle into place alongside everything else I had learned. Helen's warnings, Margaret's vigil, Claire's calculated cruelty. The pieces were finally forming a complete picture, and what I saw filled me with a cold, steady resolve. 2 victims, 1 predator, and a reckoning was coming. I spent the next week preparing. Every detail had to be perfect, every element precisely positioned. I consulted with Thomas Reed about the legal implications, with Margaret about the emotional stakes, and with my own conscience about whether what I was planning was justice or revenge. In the end, I decided it did not matter. What mattered was the truth, and the truth had been buried long enough. I called Claire on a Tuesday evening, keeping my voice warm and conciliatory. I've been thinking about our family, I said, about how fractured we've become since Helen died. I'd like to invite you and Daniel to dinner this Saturday. A chance to start fresh, to find our way back to being a real family again. There was a pause on the line, and I could almost hear Claire calculating, weighing the possibilities. That's very generous of you, Robert, she said finally, her voice smooth as silk. We'd love to come. She arrived on Saturday wearing her finest dress, a deep burgundy that complemented her carefully styled hair and immaculate makeup. In her hands, she carried a bottle of wine that probably cost more than most people's monthly grocery bills. She smiled as she crossed my threshold, the smile of a woman who believed she had already won, who saw this dinner as the final surrender of a foolish old man who had briefly forgotten his place. Daniel followed behind her, pale and tense, his eyes meeting mine with a question I answered with the slightest nod. He knew what was coming. We had planned this together. The first hour passed in pleasant conversation. I served the meal I had prepared, a roast chicken with vegetables, simple and traditional, the kind of dinner Helen used to make for special occasions. Claire complimented the food with exaggerated enthusiasm, speaking about how wonderful it was to have these family moments, how much she had missed the warmth of gathering together. Every word dripped with performance, and I let her perform, waiting for the right moment. It came between the main course and dessert. Before we continue, I said, rising from my chair, there's something I'd like to share with you both. A message from Helen. Claire's smile flickered. From Helen? Robert? She's been gone for 3 years. She left something behind, something she wanted you to see. I walked to the television mounted on the wall and picked up the remote. My hand was steady as I pressed play, and Helen's face filled the screen. She looked directly into the camera, her eyes sharp despite her illness, her voice clear and unwavering. Claire, she began, and I watched the color drain from my daughter-in-law's face. I know exactly who you are. I've watched you for years, manipulating my son, using my husband's kindness as a weapon against him. I saw the way you isolated Daniel, the way you positioned yourself to control everything we built, and I made sure Robert would see the truth when the time was right. Claire stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. Turn it off, "Robert, turn it off right now." But the video continued. Helen spoke about the evidence she had gathered, the patterns she had observed, the legal protections she had put in place. She spoke with the calm authority of a woman who had spent months preparing for this moment, knowing she would not be alive to see it. When the video ended, I placed a folder on the table in front of Claire. "Emails," I said simply. 5 years of them. Every threat you made to Daniel, every reminder of what you would do if he ever stood against you, every word of blackmail, printed and documented. Claire's hands trembled as she opened the folder, her eyes scanning the pages. Her perfect composure crumbled, piece by piece, as she saw the evidence of her own cruelty laid out before her. Daniel spoke for the first time since we sat down. "You told me no one would ever know." His voice was quiet, hollow. "You promised that if I did what you wanted, you would keep my secret forever. But you kept records. You saved everything. Probably so you could use it again if you ever needed more leverage." "Daniel, please," Claire whispered. "You don't understand. I did this for us, for our family. You did this for yourself." He looked at her with an expression I had never seen on his face before, something that was not quite anger and not quite pity. He turned to me and said softly, "She's not evil, Dad. She's broken, just like me." I looked at my son, surprised by the compassion in his voice even now. But before I could respond, Claire let out a sound that was half sob, half laugh, and sank back into her chair. The folder fell from her hands, pages scattering across the table like fallen leaves. The mask didn't just slip, it shattered into 1,000 pieces. The silence that followed Claire's breakdown stretched through the dining room like a held breath. She sat slumped in her chair, mascara streaking down her cheeks, her carefully constructed armor lying in ruins around her. For the first time since I had known her, she looked small, diminished, human in a way she had never allowed herself to appear. I remained standing, the television screen now dark behind me, Helen's final message delivered. Part of me had expected to feel triumphant in this moment, to experience the satisfaction of justice finally served. But looking at Claire's shattered face, I felt only a weary resolve. This was not about revenge. It had never been about revenge. It was about protection, about truth, about ensuring that the woman who had preyed on my family could never do so again. "Let me be clear about what happens now," I said, my voice steady. "The trust remains under my sole control, as it always has been. Every asset Helen and I built together over 40 years is protected by legal structures you cannot touch. Thomas Reed has been named successor trustee in the event of my incapacitation or death. If you attempt any interference, any manipulation, any legal challenge whatsoever, Thomas has standing instructions to redirect the entire estate to a charitable foundation in Helen's name. You will receive nothing, not a house, not an investment, not a single dollar." Claire's head snapped up. "You can't do that. Daniel is your son. Daniel is entitled to whatever I choose to give him, and those choices will be made based on his actions, not your demands." I looked at my son, who stood motionless by the window, his back to both of us. "The inheritance I leave to Daniel will be protected in ways that ensure you can never access it. Separate accounts, controlled distributions, every safeguard my attorneys can devise." "This is punishment," Claire whispered. "You're punishing me." "No, this is consequence. There's a difference." I gathered the scattered pages from the table and placed them back in the folder. "You spent 15 years treating my kindness as weakness and my generosity as obligation. You manipulated my son, exploited my grief, and planned to strip away everything Helen and I worked for. These are not accusations." Claire turned to Daniel, desperation flooding her features. "Daniel, please, say something. Don't let him do this to us." Daniel did not turn from the window. His reflection in the glass showed a face I could not read, emotions flickering too quickly to identify. "We can start over," Claire continued, her voice rising. "I know I made mistakes. I know I went too far. But I can change, Daniel. I can be different. We've been married for 15 years. We have children together. Doesn't that mean anything to you?" Still, Daniel said nothing. Claire rose from her chair and crossed to him, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. She reached for his arm, her fingers trembling. "Please don't leave me. I know you're angry. You have every right to be angry. But I can't lose you. I can't lose everything. Her voice cracked, and for the first time I heard something in it that sounded like genuine terror. I have no one else, Daniel. My family gave up on me years ago. My friends are your friends. If you walk away, I'll have nothing. No one. I watched her cling to my son, and I realized that beneath all her scheming and manipulation, Claire was afraid of the same thing that haunts most people at their core: abandonment, isolation, the prospect of facing the world completely alone. It did not excuse what she had done. It did not make her crimes any less calculated or cruel, but it made her, in that moment, painfully human. Daniel finally turned from the window. He looked at his wife, at the woman who had controlled him through fear for 5 years, who had used his worst mistake as a weapon against him. I expected to see anger in his face, or perhaps the cold satisfaction of a prisoner finally freed from his chains. Instead, I saw conflict, uncertainty, a pain that went deeper than anything Claire's blackmail could have inflicted. "I need time," he said quietly. "I can't make this decision tonight." Claire's grip on his arm tightened. "But you're not saying no. You're not saying you're leaving." "I'm not saying anything, Claire. Not yet." He gently removed her hand and stepped back. "I need to think. About everything. About what you did. About what I did. About what kind of future is even possible after all of this." He walked toward the front door, pausing only to look at me. "I'll call you tomorrow, Dad. Thank you for showing me the truth, even if I don't know what to do with it yet." Then he was gone, the door closing softly behind him, leaving Claire and me alone in the wreckage of the evening. She stood where Daniel had left her, arms wrapped around herself, tears still falling silently. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. "He won't leave me," she said finally, but her voice held no conviction. "He can't. After everything, he can't just walk away." I did not respond. I had no words of comfort for her, no reassurance to offer. But as I watched her standing there, stripped of power and pretense, I found that I could not muster hatred either, only a profound exhaustion and the lingering worry that had taken root in my chest the moment I saw Daniel's face. My son had not looked relieved when the truth came out. He had not celebrated his freedom or embraced the chance to escape. He had looked like a man standing at the edge of a cliff, uncertain whether to step back to safety or leap into the unknown. Claire finally understood what she had lost, but Daniel's silence worried Robert more than her tears. The week that followed the dinner was the longest of my life. I moved through my days in a state of suspended animation, unable to focus on anything beyond the question of what Daniel would decide. I replayed our conversations in my mind, searching for clues, trying to predict which way he would turn. Margaret visited daily, offering quiet companionship and cups of tea that grew cold while I stared out the window. She did not push me to talk, and I was grateful for her patience. I had expected Daniel to call within a day or two. When 3 days passed without word, I began to worry. When 5 days passed, worry turned to dread. I imagined him paralyzed by indecision, trapped between loyalty to his father and some inexplicable bond to the woman who had tormented him. I imagined Claire working on him, using every tool in her arsenal to rebuild the walls I had torn down. I imagined my son slipping back into the prison he had inhabited for 5 years, the door closing behind him before I could reach through and pull him free. On the 7th day, Daniel appeared at my door. He looked different than he had at the dinner. The panic had faded from his eyes, replaced by something calmer but no less troubled. He had shaved, combed his hair, put on clean clothes. These small details of self-care struck me as significant, though I could not have said why. "Can we talk, Dad?" he asked. I led him into the living room, the same room where he had confessed his secret, where I had held him while he sobbed. We sat in the same positions, facing each other across the coffee table, the autumn light slanting through the windows. "I've made my decision," he said. I leaned forward, my heart pounding. "Tell me." He took a deep breath, and I saw his hands tremble slightly before he steadied them against his knees. "I'm staying with her, Dad." The words landed like a physical blow. I sat back, stunned, certain I had misheard. "You're what?" "I'm staying with Claire. I'm not filing for divorce." "Daniel, after everything she did to you, after 5 years of blackmail, of manipulation, of using your own mistake as a weapon against you, you're choosing to stay?" "I'm not choosing her." His voice was quiet, but firm. I'm choosing responsibility. I shook my head, unable to comprehend what I was hearing. Explain that to me, because from where I'm sitting, it sounds like you're walking back into a cage. Daniel was silent for a long moment, gathering his thoughts. When he spoke again, his words came slowly, carefully, as if he had rehearsed them many times before arriving at my door. Claire is broken, Dad. I don't mean that as an excuse for what she did. There is no excuse. But I've spent the last week thinking about who she really is, underneath all the manipulation and control. She has no family. Did you know that? Her parents disowned her when she was 22. Her sister hasn't spoken to her in 15 years. Every friend she's ever had, she eventually drove away. Before she met me, she was completely alone in the world. That's not your fault. That's not your problem to solve. Maybe not. But here's what I keep coming back to. He leaned forward, his eyes meeting mine with an intensity I had rarely seen from him. If I leave her now, what happens? She loses everything. The money's gone, thanks to you and Thomas. Her reputation in our social circle will be destroyed once word gets out about what she did. She'll be alone, desperate, and more dangerous than ever. That's her consequence to bear, Daniel, not yours. But it doesn't end with her, Dad. That's what I can't stop thinking about. He ran a hand through his hair, frustration creeping into his voice. Claire is a predator. If I abandon her now, she'll find another target, another family to infiltrate, another husband to manipulate, another elderly parent to exploit. She knows how to do it. She's been perfecting her technique for years, and whoever she finds next won't have a Helen watching over them. They won't have documentation or legal protections or someone like Thomas Reed in their corner. They'll be defenseless. I wanted to argue. I wanted to tell him he was being foolish, that his responsibility ended at his own doorstep, that he had no obligation to serve as the world's guardian against Claire's future schemes. But something in his face stopped me. He was not speaking from weakness. He was speaking from a hard-won understanding of who Claire was and what she was capable of. Someone needs to watch her, Daniel continued. Someone needs to make sure she doesn't hurt anyone else. And who better than me? I know all her tricks. I've lived with them for 15 years. I can see her coming from a mile away now. He laughed bitterly. In a way, those 5 years of blackmail were an education. She taught me exactly how she operates. Now, I can use that knowledge to contain her. That's not love, son. That's a prison you're building for yourself. Daniel nodded slowly, acknowledging the truth of my words. I know, Dad. But it's the prison I deserve. The statement hung in the air between us, heavy with resignation and something that might have been acceptance. I stayed silent for 10 years, he continued. I watched her treat you with contempt. I let her spend your money, mock your generosity, plan for your death like it was a business opportunity. I could have spoken up at any time. I could have come to you, told you the truth, asked for help. But I was too afraid. Too weak, too worried about protecting myself and my reputation. His voice cracked. Mom died thinking her son was a good man, but I wasn't, Dad. I let Claire use me as a weapon against both of you. Daniel, please, let me finish. He held up his hand, and I fell silent. I don't expect forgiveness, not from you, not from myself. But maybe, if I spend the next however many years making sure Claire never destroys another family, I can earn back some small piece of what I lost. Maybe someday I'll deserve to be free. But not yet. Not while the damage I helped cause is still fresh. He stood, and I saw in his posture something I had not seen in years. Resolution, purpose. The spine of a man who had finally stopped running from his own reflection. I'm not asking you to understand, Dad. I'm just asking you to accept that this is my choice, my consequence, my path forward. I rose and crossed to him, placing my hands on his shoulders the way I used to when he was a boy facing something frightening. I don't agree with your decision. I think you're sacrificing yourself for someone who doesn't deserve it, but you're my son, and I will always love you, no matter what. He embraced me then, holding on tightly, and I felt the weight of everything he was carrying transfer briefly to my shoulders before he pulled away. Thank you, Dad, for everything, for the truth, for giving me the chance to finally see clearly. He walked to the door, paused with his hand on the knob, and looked back one final time. Tell Margaret I said thank you too, and tell her, Tell her that Helen would be proud of what you've become." Then he was gone, walking back to a life I could not have chosen for him, a future built not on love but on penance. I stood in the doorway watching his car disappear down the street, and I thought about the strange shapes that justice can take. Claire would live out her days with a husband who no longer loved her, watched over by the very man she had tried to control. Daniel would serve his self-imposed sentence, guarding the world against the monster he had helped create. Two people trapped together not by love, but by consequence. And somehow, that was its own kind of justice. 6 months can change a landscape in ways both visible and invisible. The old house where Helen and I had raised our son, where we had built 4 decades of memories, now belonged to a young couple expecting their first child. I had signed the papers on a gray February morning, feeling not loss but release, as if I were finally setting down a weight I had carried for too long. The house deserved laughter again, the sound of small feet running through hallways, the chaos of a family just beginning its journey. I had completed mine. My new home was smaller, a modest cottage 3 streets away from Margaret. We had chosen the location together, walking through the neighborhood on a crisp autumn afternoon, imagining the life we might build in proximity to each other. Not together, not exactly, but close enough to share meals and conversations, to tend the garden we planted in her backyard, to sit on her porch in the evenings and talk about Helen until the stars emerged. For the first time in years, I did not feel alone. Margaret and I had developed a rhythm that suited us both. Tuesday dinners at her house, Thursday dinners at mine, Saturday mornings in the garden, coaxing vegetables from soil that rewarded patience and care. Sunday afternoons reading in companionable silence, 2 people who had learned that presence matters more than words. She told me stories about Helen as a young woman, stories I had never heard, and I shared memories of the wife she had missed for 20 years. In this way, Helen remained alive between us, a presence that bound rather than haunted. Daniel kept his promise. Every month, without fail, a letter arrived in my mailbox. The envelopes were plain white, his handwriting steady and familiar. The contents were unremarkable. Updates about his work, observations about the weather, small anecdotes about the children's activities at school. He never mentioned Claire. He never wrote about his own feelings or struggles. But the letters came, month after month, a thin thread stretching across the distance between us. I wrote back each time, matching his tone, respecting the boundaries he had drawn. I told him about the garden, about Margaret's cooking, about the books I was reading. I did not push for more than he could give. Perhaps someday the letters would become phone calls, and the phone calls would become visits. Perhaps someday my son would walk through my door again, ready to rebuild what had been broken. Or perhaps this fragile correspondence was all we would ever have. Either way, I was grateful for it. A thin thread is still a connection. It can be strengthened over time. On a spring morning when the world had turned green again, I drove to the cemetery where Helen was buried. The headstone bore her name and the dates that bracketed her life, but nothing about the words engraved there could capture who she truly was. I knelt beside the grave and placed fresh flowers against the marble, then withdrew an envelope from my jacket pocket. Inside was a letter I had written the night before, sitting at my desk with Margaret's tea growing cold beside me. "You asked me once what family means," I read aloud, my voice steady despite the emotion tightening my throat. "It was early in our marriage, and I gave you some answer about blood and obligation, about the ties that bind us whether we choose them or not. You smiled and said nothing, but I could tell you disagreed." I paused, looking at her name carved in stone. I didn't understand then. I do now. Family isn't just blood. Family is who shows up when everything falls apart. Family is who protects you when you can't protect yourself. Family is who loves you enough to prepare for battles they won't live to fight. I placed the letter beside the flowers, weighing it down with a small stone so the wind would not carry it away. "You were my family, Helen, and through Margaret, through Thomas, through everything you left behind, you still are. You're still protecting me. You're still showing up, and I will spend whatever years I have left being worthy of that love." I stood slowly, my knees protesting the movement, and looked out over the peaceful rows of headstones stretching toward the horizon. Somewhere beyond my sight, Daniel was living out his chosen penance. Somewhere nearby, Margaret was preparing lunch and waiting for my return. And here, in this quiet place, Helen was resting at last, her work finally complete. I had spent so many years giving myself away, piece by piece, to people who saw my kindness as weakness. I had believed that sacrifice was the same as love, that emptying myself for others was the highest virtue. Helen had tried to teach me otherwise, but I had not been ready to learn. Now, at 68 years old, I finally understood. This time, Robert chose himself. And for once, that was enough. And so ends the story of Robert Sinclair, a man who spent 68 years believing that love meant giving without limits, only to discover that true love sometimes means protecting yourself from those who would take everything you have. Helen understood this truth before he did, and from beyond the grave, she reached back to save the man she loved from a fate he could not see coming. This story reminds us that family is not defined by blood alone. It is defined by loyalty, by sacrifice, by the people who stand beside us when the world turns cold. Robert lost his wife, but he gained a sister he never knew existed. He lost his son to a self-imposed exile, but he kept the thread of connection alive through letters that said little but meant everything. And he lost his illusions about Claire, but in doing so, he found something far more valuable: his own sense of worth. If this story touched your heart, if it made you think about the people in your own life who truly deserve the name of family, we would love to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell us about the Helens in your life, the people who protected you when you could not protect yourself. And if you know someone who needs to hear this message, someone who gives too much to people who give nothing in return, please share this story with them. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being part of this community. And remember, choosing yourself is not selfish. Sometimes it is the bravest thing you can do.